Sherlock Holmes and the Case of the Innkeeper's Daughter. A Sherlock Holmes Mystery. Chapter 1. A Curious Visitor. It was a raw morning in late October when the fog lay so thickly upon Baker Street that the lamplighters had not troubled to extinguish their flames, and the hansoms crept past our window like phantoms in the grey murk. I had risen later than my custom, the damp weather having settled into my old wound with its usual malice, and I found Sherlock Holmes already dressed and standing at the window, his violin laid aside, his sharp eyes fixed upon the street below. "You will want your coffee before you hear what I have to tell you, Watson," said he, without turning, "for I perceive we are about to have a visitor whose troubles will not wait upon a leisurely breakfast. How can you possibly know that a visitor is coming, let alone that his troubles are pressing?" I asked, settling into my chair, with the particular irritation of a man roused too early. "A man has been standing at the corner of Baker Street for the better part of 20 minutes, Holmes replied, walking to the door and away from it no fewer than 4 times, as though his courage fails him at the final step. "A countryman, by his dress, you may observe, were you at this window, that his boots are of a heavy, old-fashioned cut, thickly soled against mud rather than pavement, and his coat, though well brushed, has the unmistakable cut of a provincial tailor. He has travelled through the night or very early this morning, his collar is wilted, and he carries no umbrella despite the weather, which suggests a departure made in haste, without thought for such niceties. A man does not dither at a detective's door for 20 minutes over a trifling matter, Watson. Ah, there, he has resolved himself at last." Scarcely had Holmes finished speaking, when the bell rang below, and a few moments later Mrs. Hudson ushered into our sitting room a broad, weathered man of perhaps 55 years, his face deeply lined, his hands rough and reddened in the manner of one who has spent a lifetime in honest labour. He stood upon the threshold, turning his hat over and over in his hands, and I saw at once that Holmes's reading of him had been, as ever, precise to the smallest particular. "Mr. Holmes," the man began, his voice thick with the accent of Kent, "you'll forgive the early hour. I am Josiah Thorne, landlord of the Gilded Swan at Ashford Mire. I've come up from Kent on the first train, for I could not sit still another hour in that house, not with my Rosalind lying." He broke off, and I saw his throat work painfully before he could continue. "Not with my daughter lying dead in it, and everyone from the vicar to the coroner content to call it her own hand that did it. Pray sit down, Mr. Thorne," said Holmes gently, drawing a chair near the fire, "and tell us the whole of it from the beginning. Leave out no detail, however small it may seem to you, for it is often in the smallest details that the truth is hiding." Thorne lowered himself heavily into the chair, and for a moment he seemed unable to speak at all. I poured him a measure of brandy, which he accepted with a grateful nod, and after a swallow he found his voice once more. "My Rosalind was to be married a week from Saturday, sir, to Sir Edmund Blackwood of Marchmont Hall, the great house above the village. It was not a match of her choosing, if I am honest with you, gentlemen, for there is little love lost between a girl of 19 and a man past 40, however grand his name. But I owed Sir Edmund a debt on the inn, near £800, taken out when the roof fell in 3 winters back, and when he proposed the marriage, with the debt to be forgiven as part of the bargain, I confess I pressed her to accept. God forgive me for it now." "And your daughter agreed?" Holmes asked, his fingertips pressed together, his eyes never leaving our visitor's face. "She did, sir, though not gladly. She had been sweet on Tom Hargrave, our blacksmith's son, since they were children together, and there were harsh words between us over the match. I'll not deny it. But 3 nights passed on the Tuesday. She went up to her room after supper, seeming quiet but no more troubled than she had been for weeks. In the morning her door was found locked from within, and when we broke it open, here his composure failed him entirely, and it was some minutes before he could continue. "She was found dead, was she not?" said Holmes quietly, "and the room was locked upon the inside, with the key yet in the lock." Thorne looked up, startled. "How could you know that, sir?" "I did not know it. I inferred it, from your manner of telling the tale, and from the fact that you have travelled to London rather than accepting the verdict of your local coroner. A straightforward case does not send a father seeking Sherlock Holmes. Continue, if you please. What does the coroner say was the cause of death? Poison, sir. Laudanum, they believe, taken in her nightly cup of chamomile tea, of which she kept a small store on her washstand for her nerves. The doctor, old Dr. Ferris, who has tended our family 30 years, found no mark of violence upon her, no sign of struggle, and the door bolted from within, as I have said. The coroner's jury returned a verdict of suicide, self-administered while the balance of her mind was disturbed, and Sir Edmund himself testified that she had seemed melancholy of late, dreading the marriage. But Mr. Holmes, and here the old innkeeper leaned forward, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his chair with sudden fierce strength. I have known that girl since the hour she was born. She was not a coward, sir, whatever her sorrows. She would sooner have run off with young Hargrave in the dead of night than swallow poison in her own bed. Someone has done this thing to her. I am certain of it in my very bones, and I cannot rest until the truth is known, whatever the cost to myself or to the good name of Ashford-Meyer. Holmes was silent for a long moment, his grey eyes distant, as though he were already walking the corridors of that Kentish inn in his mind. At length he rose and crossed to the mantelpiece, where he kept his pipe and tobacco in the toe of an old Persian slipper. "Mr. Thorne," said he, "I will take your case. Watson and I shall accompany you back to Ashford-Meyer upon the next available train. But I must warn you, and I say this not to discourage you, but that you may be prepared, that if your instincts prove correct, the truth we uncover may be a harder thing to bear than the coroner's kindly falsehood. Are you certain you wish to pursue it?" "I am certain, sir," Thorne answered, without hesitation. "I would rather know the bitter truth than live the rest of my days beneath a comfortable lie." "Then we agreed," said Holmes, and there was a light in his eye that I had come to recognize well, the light of a hunter who had caught, at last, the scent of a worthy quarry. "Watson, be so good as to consult Bradshaw for the Kent trains. I do not think we shall find much rest before this matter is concluded. Quick heads up, guys. I've curated a collection of mind-bending, exclusive mystery stories, specifically for the hardcore fans among you. These cases are so intense and wild that I literally cannot upload them here on YouTube. If you have a passion for real, unedited mind twisters, do yourself a favor, drop down to the pinned comment or the description right now, hit that link, and check out this exclusive collection. It's going to absolutely blow your mind. Now, let's get straight back to today's case. Chapter 2. The Gilded Swan. The journey into Kent took the better part of 2 hours, and for much of it, Holmes sat in silence, his hat drawn low over his eyes, saying nothing at all, though I knew from the restless drumming of his fingers upon his knee that his mind was already at work upon the scant facts we possessed. Josiah Thorne sat opposite us, staring out at the passing fields with the fixed, unseeing gaze of a man whose thoughts are far from the window before him. "Tell me of Sir Edmund Blackwood," Holmes said at last, as the train rattled through the outskirts of Maidstone. "What manner of man is he?" "A hard man, Mr. Holmes, though not without his charms when he chooses to exert them. He inherited Marchmont Hall some 6 years back, upon the death of his elder brother, Captain Blackwood, who was lost at sea. Before that, he had lived abroad a good many years, India, I believe, and afterward some years in South America, upon business I never rightly understood. He returned to Kent a wealthy man, or so it was said, though there are those in the village who whisper that his fortune is not so solid as it appears, and that Marchmont Hall is mortgaged to the rafters." "Indeed," murmured Holmes, his eyes opening a fraction. "And has he been long resident at the Hall since his return?" 6 years, as I say, though he travels a good deal still, to London, and abroad now and again, sometimes for weeks at a stretch, and no one in the village the wiser as to his business. And his household? Does he keep many servants? A housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, who has been with the family time out of mind, a valet he brought back with him from his travels, a foreign-looking fellow named Raphael, close-mouthed and unfriendly to the village folk, and a few maids and grooms besides. Holmes asked a number of further questions concerning Rosalind's habits, her friendships, her correspondence, to all of which Thorne answered as best he could, though it was plain that a father's grief had left him blind to much that a stranger's eye might have caught. By the time the train drew into the small station at Ashford Mire, the fog of London had given way to a clear, cold Kentish afternoon, the sky the colour of pale slate, the fields beyond the platform silvered with the first frost of the season. The Gilded Swan proved to be a handsome old inn of the coaching era, its timbered front leaning gently with the settling of centuries, its swinging sign, a swan picked out in tarnished gilt, creaking softly in the wind. A knot of villagers had gathered near the door, and I observed them fall silent and draw back as we approached, their eyes following Thorne with an expression I could not quite read. Sympathy, certainly, but mixed with something else, a wariness almost, as though the old innkeeper carried some contagion of misfortune about him. Within, the inn was dim and low-beamed, smelling of wood smoke and ale and old polished oak. A stout woman with reddened eyes came forward at once and embraced Thorne without a word. His sister, as it proved, one Agatha Weld, who had kept house for him since his wife's death some years before, and who had evidently been Rosalind's second mother in all but name. "This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes, Aggie, come down from London to look into the matter properly," Thorne said, and I saw the woman's careworn face brighten with something like hope. "Then perhaps we shall have the truth of it at last," she said, "for I'll not believe, not if you flayed me alive, that our Rosalind ever raised a hand against herself. She was full of plans, Mr. Holmes, quiet plans, that she shared with no one, not even me, but plans all the same. A girl does not lay plans for a future she means to end." "What manner of plans, Mrs. Weld?" Holmes inquired, his attention sharpening at once. "I could not say precisely, sir, but I found her, more than once these past weeks, writing letters late into the night, and hiding them away quick as a cat when I came upon her unawares. And she had begun asking after the London coach times, and once I heard her speak, very low, to Tom Hargrave at the garden gate, of money, of needing money, and soon. I thought little of it at the time, taking it for wedding matters. Now I wonder." Holmes's eyes gleamed at this, though he said nothing further upon the subject, merely requesting that we be shown at once to Rosalind's chamber, which had, at his particular instruction, sent ahead by telegram, been left entirely undisturbed since the discovery of her body. We climbed a narrow twisting stair to the upper floor, where a low door stood at the end of a dim passage, its lock still splintered about the frame where it had been forced 3 mornings before. Thorne could not bring himself to enter, and remained upon the landing, his hand pressed to the wall, while Mrs. Weld led us within. It was a small plain chamber such as one might expect in a country inn. A narrow bed, a washstand, a modest wardrobe, a single window looking out over the inn yard toward the dark shoulder of the downs beyond. Yet even in its plainness there was evidence of a thoughtful, careful nature. A shelf of well-worn books, a small vase of dried flowers, a sampler worked in neat stitches upon the wall. Holmes stood upon the threshold for a long moment without entering, his eyes moving slowly over every feature of the room, missing nothing. "You will observe, Watson," said he at last, very quietly, "that this is not the chamber of a careless or a disordered mind. Everything here speaks of order, of habit, of a woman who kept her affairs, whatever their secret nature, in careful arrangement. Such minds do not commonly choose the sudden, untidy violence of self-murder. They plan, they prepare, and a woman who plans does not leave her plans unfinished without very good reason indeed." He stepped at last into the room, moving with that peculiar, crouching, hound-like gait I had seen him adopt upon 100 occasions, and began his examination in earnest. Chapter 3. The Locked Room. For the better part of an hour, I watched Holmes move about that small chamber with the silent, methodical intensity that always marked his finest investigations, while Mrs. Weld and I stood aside, scarcely daring to speak. He examined the window first, throwing it open and leaning far out over the sill to study the wall below, then the drain pipe some 4 feet distant, then the sloping roof of the scullery beneath. The window was found closed, I take it. On the morning she was discovered, he asked. Closed and latched from within, sir, Mrs. Weld confirmed. I latched it myself many a night when I came up to bid her good night, and it was fastened just so when we broke in the door. And the door itself, you say it was locked, with the key in the lock upon the inside. Turned twice, sir, as was her habit, for she was always a careful girl about her door, living as she did in a house of strangers passing through most nights. Holmes turned his attention next to the door itself, crouching before the splintered frame, and drawing from his pocket the small folding lens he carried always upon such expeditions. He studied the lock with great care, then the floor immediately before it. Then, to my considerable puzzlement, the narrow gap beneath the door itself, no more than 1/2 inch in height. Watson, be so good as to fetch a candle, said he. And when I had done so, he held the flame close to the floorboards just within the room, so close that I feared he might scorch them, moving it slowly along the length of the gap beneath the door. Ha! He exclaimed suddenly, and I saw a thin, satisfied smile cross his lips. The smile I had learned, that meant some small but significant fact, had confirmed a suspicion already forming in that extraordinary mind. He said nothing more upon the matter, however, but rose and turned his attention to the washstand, where a small brown bottle and an overturned cup still stood exactly as they had been found. He lifted the bottle with great delicacy, holding it to the light, sniffing at its neck, and then examining the cork with his lens for what seemed a very long time. This is the laudanum, I presume. It is, sir. She kept it always by her, a small dose most nights, for she suffered from a nervous complaint since a child, and old Dr. Ferris prescribed it years ago to help her sleep. And this cup, this was the chamomile tea in which the fatal dose is believed to have been mixed. Yes, sir. She brewed it herself most nights upon the little spirit lamp you see there, and took it before bed. Holmes lifted the cup as well, turning it over slowly, examining the dried residue that yet clung to its inner surface, and then, to my very great surprise, he touched his little finger to that residue and raised it, very briefly, to the tip of his tongue. "Holmes!" I exclaimed, "surely that is a needless risk. A trace so old and so diluted could do me no serious harm, Watson, and it tells me a great deal that no amount of examination by eye alone could reveal." He set the cup down with exaggerated care. The chamomile is genuine, a properly brewed infusion, nothing amiss in that regard. But there is a bitterness beneath the herbal note that is not the bitterness of laudanum. Laudanum has a particular character upon the tongue, one I have had occasion to study closely in the course of other investigations. This is something else. Poison of another kind, then? Not the laudanum, after all. That I cannot yet say with certainty. The residue is too old, too faint, for me to be entirely confident of my own palate in the matter. It will want a proper chemical analysis, and I shall take a scraping of it back to London for that purpose. But mark this well, Watson. If the coroner's surgeon assumed the cause of death to be an overdose of laudanum upon the strength of the bottle standing empty beside the cup, without troubling to test the residue in the cup itself against the known character of that particular drug, then the coroner's surgeon has committed an error that may have sent an innocent verdict out into the world. He turned next to the small writing desk beneath the window, its surface bare save for an inkstand and a blotter, and began examining the blotter with close attention, holding it up to the light at an angle so that the faint impressions of long-absorbed ink might catch the light and reveal something of what had once been written upon paper long since removed. "She wrote a great many letters at this desk," he murmured, half to himself, "and burned or otherwise disposed of most of them, for I find no drafts, no discarded sheets, in the waste-paper basket, which suggests a mind very deliberately covering its own tracks. That is not the behaviour of a girl idly composing love letters to her blacksmith's son, Mrs. Weld. That is the behaviour of a woman engaged in some secret and careful business she wished no one, not even her own family, to discover. He straightened at last and stood a moment in the centre of the room, his eyes travelling once more over every particular of it, as though committing the whole scene permanently to that vast storehouse of memory he was so justly famous for. "There is one thing more I should like to know," said he, turning at last to Mrs. Weld. "You said that Rosalind asked after the London coach times these past weeks. Do you know upon what date she intended to travel had she gone?" Mrs. Weld considered. "I could not say for certain, sir, but I recall she asked most particularly about the Thursday coach, the one that leaves the Mire at 7 in the morning and reaches London by early afternoon." "Thursday," Holmes repeated softly, and I saw some private calculation working behind his eyes. "She died upon Tuesday night, and asked after the Thursday coach. 2 days, Watson. Whatever she intended, whatever secret business called her toward London, she meant to accomplish it within 48 hours of her death. That is a very suggestive coincidence indeed, if it is a coincidence at all." He turned toward the door. "Come, I have seen what this room has to tell us for the present. Let us go down and speak with this Dr. Ferris, and after him, I think, with Sir Edmund Blackwood himself." Chapter 4. Threads of Silk. Dr. Ferris received us in the small parlour of his cottage near the church, a stooped, gentle old man whose hands trembled slightly as he poured out tea, though his eyes remained sharp and clear beneath thick white brows. He had attended the Thorne family, he told us, for the better part of 3 decades, and had brought Rosalind herself into the world upon a stormy February night 19 years before. "I do not say the verdict was wrong lightly, Mr. Holmes," he said, when Holmes had put to him the question of the coroner's finding. "I have examined a body or two in my time, and I saw nothing to contradict a diagnosis of laudanum poisoning, the pupils contracted, the breathing shallow before death, the general appearance consistent in every particular with an overdose of that drug." "Did you test the residue in the cup itself, doctor, against a known sample of laudanum, or did you infer the cause of death from the empty bottle found beside it?" The old doctor's face coloured slightly. "I confess I did not think a chemical test necessary, given the bottle, and the circumstances of the young lady's evident unhappiness regarding her approaching marriage." "Just so," said Holmes, with a courtesy that could not entirely disguise the edge beneath it. "And yet, doctor, I have myself tasted that residue not 2 hours past, and I tell you plainly that it does not answer to the character of laudanum as I know it. There is a note of bitterness in it, sharper, more metallic, that I associate rather with certain alkaloid poisons of a different family altogether. I do not ask you to take my word upon so grave a matter, but I would earnestly request that you permit a proper chemical analysis of a scraping I have taken, at my own expense, before this case is allowed to rest." Dr. Ferris looked troubled, but after a moment's consideration he nodded gravely. "If there is any doubt at all, Mr. Holmes, then in fairness to that poor child and her father, the doubt must be resolved. I shall write at once to my colleague in Maidstone, who has the proper apparatus for such analysis." We took our leave shortly after, and as we walked back through the village toward the inn, Holmes fell into one of his silent, abstracted moods, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed upon the middle distance. It was not until we had nearly reached the Gilded Swan that he spoke again. "There is a servant girl at the inn, Watson, Sally, I believe her name is, who discovered the body upon that fatal morning. I should like to speak with her before we call upon Sir Edmund, for a servant's eye often catches what a father's grief overlooks entirely." We found Sally in the inn's small kitchen, a thin, freckled girl of perhaps 16, who curtsied nervously and seemed near tears at the mere mention of that terrible morning. Holmes spoke to her with a gentleness I had not always seen him employ with witnesses, drawing her out slowly, patiently, until at last she began to speak more freely. "I knocked at 7:30 as always, sir, and when there weren't no answer I knocked again, louder, thinking she'd overslept. When she still didn't answer I fetched the master, and he put his shoulder to the door, for it was bolted fast from within. And when the door gave way, describe to me exactly what you saw, and in what order you saw it." take your time. The window first, sir, for it faces the door and catches the morning light. It was shut tight, same as always. Then I saw Miss Rosalind upon the bed, lying so still and so pale, and the cup fallen from her hand upon the coverlet, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, and it was some moments before she could continue. And I noticed, sir, though I didn't think much of it then, that the curtain by the window was caught upon the latch, as if it had been pulled hard and not smoothed back proper. Holmes's eyes sharpened at once. Caught upon the latch, you say? Might I trouble you to show me precisely how? Sally led us at once back up the narrow stair to Rosalind's chamber, and there, upon the brass latch of the window, Holmes discovered, with an exclamation of quiet triumph, a single fine thread of dark silk, no more than half an inch in length, caught fast where the metal had snagged it. "This," said he, drawing it free with the utmost delicacy and holding it up to the light between finger and thumb, "is not a thread from any curtain in this room, Sally. Unless I am very much mistaken, the curtains here are of a plain wool damask, are they not? And this fibre is silk, and dyed, moreover, a shade of deep green, not commonly seen in a country bedchamber. It is the sort of silk one finds in a gentleman's cravat, or the lining of a well-cut coat." "Do you mean, Holmes," I said, feeling the chill of the implication even as I spoke it, "that someone was at that window, someone from outside, on the very night Rosalind died?" "I mean that this thread was not here by accident, Watson, and that a window latched from within, upon a room whose door was bolted fast, is not so impregnable a fortress as our friends at Scotland Yard would have us believe, provided a man is willing to climb, and is not overly troubled by a fall of some 15 feet onto a sloping roof, should his footing prove uncertain." He wrapped the thread with great care in a fold of paper and placed it within his notebook. "I begin to form a picture of this case, Sally, though it is yet far from complete. Tell me, in the days before her death, did Miss Rosalind receive any visitors you did not recognize? Any strangers to the village?" The girl hesitated, then said slowly, "There was a gentleman, sir, come twice in the fortnight before, foreign-looking, dark, and very quiet. He came after dark both times, and spoke with Miss Rosalind in the garden, low, so as none should overhear. I took him for one of Sir Edmund's people, for I saw him walking the Marchmont Road after, toward the hall." Holmes said nothing for a long moment, but I saw the light of the chase kindle fully in his eyes. "The valet," he murmured. "Raphael. Watson, I think it is high time we paid our respects to Sir Edmund Blackwood." Chapter 5. The Blacksmith's Temper. Before we made our way to Marchmont Hall, however, Holmes expressed a wish to speak first with Tom Hargrave, the blacksmith's son of whom both Thorne and Mrs. Weld had spoken. The young man who had, by common report, quarrelled bitterly with Rosalind but 2 days before her death, and who was, in the eyes of the village at large, the likeliest suspect had the coroner's jury not settled so comfortably upon a verdict of suicide. We found him at the forge at the edge of the village, a tall, broad-shouldered young man of perhaps 22, his dark hair damp with sweat, his leather apron scorched in a dozen places, hammering with fierce, unnecessary force upon a piece of iron that seemed already well past the shape required of it. He looked up as we approached, and I saw suspicion flare instantly in his eyes. "You'll be the London detective," he said, setting down his hammer, but not troubling to disguise the hostility in his voice. "Come to hang the blame on me, same as everyone else in this village has already done in their hearts, whatever the coroner said." "I have come to learn the truth, Mr. Hargrave, whatever shape it takes," Holmes replied evenly. "If that truth exonerates you, you have nothing to fear from my questions. If it does not, well, then you would do better to answer them honestly than to meet them with a hammer in your hand." For a moment I thought the young man might indeed turn violent, so dark was the look that crossed his face. But then, quite suddenly, his shoulders sagged, and he sat down heavily upon an overturned barrel, burying his face in his blackened hands. "I loved her, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice muffled and thick. Loved her since we was children together, fishing in the mill stream and stealing apples from old Grantham's orchard. When her father told her she was to marry that Blackwood, for the sake of a debt, I near went mad with the unfairness of it. We quarrelled, the Sunday before she died. I begged her to run off with me, to London, to America, anywhere at all, and be damned to the debt and the marriage both. I had a little money put by, not much, but enough to start us somewhere new. And what did she say to this proposal? Holmes asked, seating himself upon a bench nearby with an air of unhurried patience. She said she couldn't, not yet, that there was something she had to see to first, something that would set everything right, for her father and for us both. If only she had a little more time. She wouldn't say what it was, however I pressed her, only that I must trust her and be patient a little longer, and that soon she would have money enough that we shouldn't need to run off like thieves in the night at all. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. I thought she meant to appeal to Sir Edmund's better nature, or some such foolishness, to release her from the match. I never thought for one moment that she meant to— He could not finish the sentence. You do not believe she took her own life, Holmes said. It was not a question. Never, sir. Not in 1,000 years. She was the bravest, most stubborn creature I ever knew. She'd have fought that marriage to her last breath, and fought Blackwood himself if it came to it, before she'd have swallowed poison and given up the fight so easy. His hands clenched into fists upon his knees. Someone did this to her, Mr. Holmes, and if you cannot prove it, then by God I shall find my own way to make Sir Edmund answer for it, whatever it costs me. That sort of talk will help neither Rosalind nor yourself, Mr. Hargrave, Holmes said, not unkindly, but with a firmness that brooked no argument. Tell me, this money she spoke of, have you any notion at all of its source? Did she ever mention a solicitor, a bank, a relation in London, anyone who might have dealings with an inheritance, or a trust of some kind? Hargrave frowned, thinking hard. There was a name she mentioned once. Now you press me on it. Ashworth, I believe, or something near to it. A lawyer's name, I took it to be, for she said it in the way one speaks of business, not of a person known socially. She'd had a letter from London a few weeks back that seemed to trouble and excite her both at once, and I believe that name was upon the envelope, though I saw it only a moment, over her shoulder. Holmes's eyes had grown very bright indeed at this intelligence, though his voice remained perfectly level. Ashworth. Thank you, Mr. Hargrave. That is most useful. One thing more, and then we shall leave you to your work. Where were you upon the Tuesday night in question, between the hours of 10 and midnight? Here, sir, at the forge, working late upon a commission for the hall itself. New hinges for the stable door that Sir Edmund's man had ordered in some haste. My father can vouch for it. He was abed above the smithy the whole while, and would have heard me at the anvil, for the walls are thin, and I worked past 11. Holmes nodded slowly. I shall verify that with your father in due course, though I confess I am inclined to believe you already, Mr. Hargrave. A man does not forge stable hinges with such evident bitterness in his heart, while plotting murder in his mind. The two occupations do not commonly keep company. He rose, brushing a fleck of soot from his sleeve. I would ask you to remain in the village for the present, and to speak of this conversation to no one, particularly not to anyone from Marchmont Hall. Can I trust you in that? You can, sir, if it helps find who really did this to her. As we walked away from the forge, back toward the village green, I turned to Holmes with the question that had been forming in my mind throughout the interview. You believe him innocent, then? I believe him a young man consumed by grief and helpless fury, Watson, which is a very different thing from a murderer, and generally wears a very different face. But more than that, consider the name he has given us. Ashworth. A solicitor's name, attached to a letter that both troubled and excited a girl who spoke, in her final days, of coming into money that would set everything right. I begin to suspect, Watson, that this case turns not upon a lover's jealousy or a bride's despair at all, but upon something a great deal older and a great deal colder, the question of who stood to gain and who stood to lose, should Rosalind Thorne have lived to claim whatever it was that solicitor's letter promised her. Chapter 6. Sir Edmund Blackwood Marchmont Hall stood upon a low rise above the village, a grey stone house of the last century, handsome enough in its proportions but bearing, on closer inspection, the unmistakable signs of neglected wealth. Ivy grown wild and unchecked across half the east wing, a fountain in the forecourt long since run dry and choked with dead leaves, paint peeling from window frames that had once, evidently, been kept with pride. Josiah Thorne's whispered suspicion that the Blackwood fortune was not so solid as it appeared seemed, to my eye at least, borne out by the very stones of the place. We were admitted by a dour, silent housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, as Thorne had named her, who showed us into a large, cold drawing-room hung with portraits of Blackwoods long dead, and left us to wait some considerable time before Sir Edmund himself appeared. He was a tall man, handsome in a hard, weathered fashion, his face burned dark by years beneath foreign suns, his hair iron grey at the temples, though he could not, I judged, have been much past 45. He wore an expression of careful, cultivated grief as he entered, but I noted, and I saw Holmes note also, that his eyes were sharp and watchful, assessing us both in the moment before he spoke a single word. "Mr. Holmes, I had heard you were retained in this sad business." His voice was smooth, cultured, with the faintest trace of some foreign inflection long since polished away by education and design. "I confess I do not entirely see the necessity. The coroner's verdict was quite clear, and I should have thought a man of your reputation had better cases to occupy his talents than the sorrows of a country inn." "Every case has its own claims upon my attention, Sir Edmund," Holmes replied, settling himself into a chair without invitation, in a manner I had seen him adopt before when he wished to unsettle a witness's composure from the outset. "I understand you were to be married to Miss Thorne within the fortnight." "I was, and I grieve her loss most sincerely, whatever construction the village gossips may choose to place upon our arrangement. It was not, perhaps, a match born of romance in the storybook fashion, but I had come to feel a genuine regard for her, and had hoped we might build a contented life together in time. You testified before the coroner that she had seemed melancholy of late, dreading the marriage, I believe were your words. I did so testify, and I believe it to have been the truth. She was a sensitive girl, Mr. Holmes, unused to the responsibilities that would have come with her new position, and I fear the prospect weighed upon her more heavily than either of us anticipated. "And yet," said Holmes, his voice deceptively mild, "I have this very afternoon spoken with 3 separate persons, her father, her aunt, and a young man of her close acquaintance, none of whom described her as melancholy in the least, but rather as a young woman engaged in some active, secret business of her own, corresponding with a London solicitor named Ashworth, and speaking of a sum of money that would soon set matters right for herself and for those she loved. Can you shed any light, Sir Edmund, upon what that business might have been?" For the first time, I saw something flicker behind Sir Edmund's composed features, the briefest tightening about the eyes, gone almost before I had registered it, but unmistakable to a man trained, as I was, in the observation of the human countenance under strain. "I know nothing of any solicitor, Mr. Holmes, nor of any money beyond the settlement I had arranged upon our marriage, which was to clear her father's debt and provide her a comfortable annuity besides. If she corresponded with a lawyer, it is news to me, and I cannot imagine what business she might have had that she chose not to share with her future husband." "Perhaps," Holmes said, watching him closely, "she did not consider you entitled to share in it. Tell me, Sir Edmund, where were you upon the night of her death, between the hours of 10 and midnight?" "Here, at the Hall, in my study, engaged upon my correspondence, as I generally am of an evening. My valet can confirm it if confirmation is required, for he brought me a fresh decanter of brandy shortly before 11 and found me at my desk as usual. Your valet, Raphael I believe he is called, again that flicker, quickly mastered. Yes, he has been with me since my years abroad, and is entirely trustworthy. I understand he has been seen visiting Miss Thorne at the inn, after dark, on at least 2 occasions in the fortnight preceding her death. Can you account for that? Sir Edmund's jaw tightened visibly now, the mask of practiced grief slipping, just enough to reveal something harder and colder beneath it. I sent him with certain messages regarding the wedding arrangements, matters of settlement of the marriage contract, that I did not wish committed to paper where servants at the inn might read them over her shoulder. There is nothing sinister in it, Mr. Holmes, whatever the village tongues may have made of it. I make nothing of anything, Sir Edmund, until I have examined it fully, Holmes said, rising at last from his chair. I should like, if I may, to speak with Raphael myself before we conclude our business here today. That will not be possible at present. I have sent him to Maidstone this morning upon an errand, and I do not expect his return before tomorrow evening at the earliest. Then I shall call again tomorrow evening, Holmes said pleasantly, though there was steel beneath the pleasantry that I recognized well. One thing more, Sir Edmund, before we take our leave. I understand your elder brother, Captain Blackwood, was lost at sea some 6 years ago, which brought you into your present inheritance. Might I ask the circumstances of that loss? The question seemed to catch Sir Edmund entirely off guard, and for a moment he simply stared at Holmes, his composure visibly rattled for the first time in our interview. I fail to see what my brother's death, tragic as it was, has to do with the matter at hand, Mr. Holmes. He was lost when his vessel went down off the coast of Brazil, in a storm that claimed the lives of nearly all aboard. It was a matter of public record at the time, and I resent the implication that there is anything more to be said upon the subject. I imply nothing, Sir Edmund, Holmes said, moving toward the door. I merely gather facts, as is my habit, for one never knows in advance which facts shall prove significant, and which shall prove merely incidental. Good day to you. I trust we shall speak again very soon. As we walked back down the long drive toward the village, the autumn light fading fast into a chill blue dusk, I turned to Holmes with the question uppermost in my mind. You suspect him, then? I suspect everyone, and no one at this stage, Watson, which is precisely the discipline this profession demands. But I will tell you this much. Sir Edmund Blackwood is a man skilled in the art of controlled grief and rehearsed answers, and such skill is not commonly found in an innocent man surprised by sudden tragedy. It is found, rather, in men who have had long practice in the concealment of far darker matters. I think we shall find that his brother's death at sea, and his own long years abroad, and this mysterious valet of his, and the solicitor Ashworth, and Rosalind's secret hoard of money to come, are none of them separate threads at all, but a single cord, wound tight about this house and this family, waiting only for the proper hand to unravel it. Chapter 7. The Apothecary's Ledger. The village apothecary, one Mr. Cudlip, kept his shop in a narrow, crooked building near the church, its window crowded with coloured bottles and dried herbs hanging in bunches from the low rafters. He was a small, precise man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles perpetually sliding down his nose, and he greeted Holmes's inquiries with the nervous eagerness of a man unused to attention from London detectives. I have already told the coroner everything I know, sir, he said, polishing his spectacles for perhaps the 3rd time in as many minutes. Miss Thorne bought her laudanum here regular as clockwork, a small bottle each month, same as she had for years, upon Dr. Ferris's standing prescription. There was nothing irregular in the amount, nothing that might account for so large a dose as would prove fatal. I am not concerned with the laudanum, Mr. Cudlip, but with your ledger of sales for the past 2 months, Holmes said. I should like to examine it, if you would be so kind, with particular attention to any purchase of a more unusual character, any poison, any alkaloid preparation, sold to a customer not among your regular clientele. Cudlip hesitated, glancing toward the door as though fearing observation, then reached beneath his counter and produced a heavy, leather-bound volume, which he laid open before Holmes with evident reluctance. There is one entry, sir, that troubled me somewhat at the time, though I thought little enough of it, for such purchases are not so uncommon as the layman might suppose, for the destruction of rats and such like vermin about the stables. Holmes bent over the ledger with his lens, and I saw his eyes move swiftly down the columns of cramped, faded handwriting until they fixed upon a single entry some 3 weeks old. Aconitine, he read aloud, very softly. A quantity of aconitine, purchased upon the 14th of the month, signed for by— he paused, studying the signature closely. By R. Delgado. Who is this R. Delgado, Mr. Cudlip? I could not say for certain, sir, save that he was a dark, foreign-looking fellow, very quiet, who told me it was wanted for the stables up at Marchmont Hall, where they had been troubled with rats in the granary. I had no cause to doubt him, for such requests come from the great houses often enough, and he paid in good coin and gave no other trouble. Holmes straightened slowly, and I saw upon his face the particular stillness that always marked the moment when some vital piece of a puzzle had at last fallen into place. Aconitine, Watson, he said, turning to me. A most deadly alkaloid, derived from the monkshood plant, colourless, virtually tasteless save for a faint, sharp bitterness upon the tongue. A bitterness, I might add, entirely consistent with what I tasted in the residue of that cup only this morning. It is swift in its action, difficult to detect by ordinary post-mortem examination, unless the examiner knows precisely what to search for, and its symptoms, a slowing of the breath, a stilling of the heart, an appearance of peaceful sleep, might very easily be mistaken, by a country doctor unfamiliar with its particular signature, for the effects of an overdose of laudanum. Then it was murder after all, I said, though the confirmation, half expected as it was, still struck me with the force of genuine horror. And this Delgado, surely that is Sir Edmund's valet, under some assumed or shortened name. I would wager a considerable sum upon it, Watson, though I should like to confirm the matter before we make any accusation we cannot support. Mr. Cudlip, I must ask that you say nothing of this conversation to anyone, not to Sir Edmund's household, not to the coroner, not even to your own family, until I give you leave to speak of it. Can you promise me that? You have my word, sir, though I confess I am now considerably alarmed by what I may have unwittingly assisted in. You could not have known, and you are assisting now, most materially, in bringing the truth to light. That is a service, not a crime. Holmes closed the ledger gently and laid a hand for a moment upon the old apothecary's shoulder, a rare gesture of warmth that I had not often seen him extend to witnesses in the course of an investigation. One thing more, before we take our leave. Might I trouble you to make me up a small quantity of a harmless preparation, chalk and water, coloured to resemble a tincture, such as might pass at a glance for a genuine medicine? I have a use for it that I shall explain in due course. Cudlip, though plainly mystified, agreed readily enough, and within a quarter hour Holmes had secured a small brown bottle, indistinguishable in outward appearance from a dozen others upon the apothecary's shelves, which he slipped carefully into his coat pocket without further explanation. As we left the shop and made our way back through the gathering dusk toward the Gilded Swan, I pressed him for some account of his purpose. What possible use can you have for a bottle of coloured chalk water, Holmes? Patience, Watson. A trap well laid requires bait that appears genuine to the creature it is meant to catch, and I have not yet decided precisely how or when this particular bait shall be employed. For the present we have established 3 things of the first importance: that Rosalind Thorne died not by her own hand, nor by an accidental overdose of her own prescribed medicine, but by the deliberate administration of a rare and deadly poison, that this poison was purchased, under a false pretext, by a man answering closely to the description of Sir Edmund's valet, and that Rosalind herself was engaged, in the final weeks of her life, in some secret correspondence with a London solicitor, concerning a sum of money that someone, evidently, considered worth killing to prevent her from ever receiving. He paused at the edge of the village green, looking back toward the dark, looming shape of Marchmont Hall upon its rise above the rooftops, its windows now beginning to show the first lit lamps of evening. The question that remains, Watson, is the oldest and simplest question in all of criminal investigation, and yet so often the most difficult to answer with certainty. Who, precisely, stood to gain by Rosalind Thorne's silence, and how much, exactly, was that silence worth to them? Chapter 5. A Conversation with Lestrade. We returned to the Gilded Swan to find, somewhat to my surprise and rather more to Holmes's evident irritation, that a telegram had arrived announcing the imminent arrival of Inspector Lestrade from Scotland Yard, dispatched at the instruction of the Kent Constabulary. Once word of Holmes's involvement, and his stated doubts regarding the coroner's verdict, had reached the appropriate official ears. They have grown suspicious that a private investigation might embarrass the local force if it uncovers what the coroner missed, Holmes remarked dryly, folding the telegram and tossing it onto the table before the fire. So they send Lestrade to look over my shoulder and claim whatever credit is to be had should I prove correct, while distancing themselves from any embarrassment should I prove mistaken. It is ever the way of officialdom, Watson, though I confess Lestrade himself is honest enough in his own limited fashion, and not entirely without his uses. The inspector arrived upon the last train from London that evening, a wiry, sharp-featured man whom I had encountered upon several previous occasions, and whose manner toward Holmes had softened over the years from open scepticism into a grudging, if still competitive, respect. He greeted us in the inn's small private parlour with his customary brisk energy, shaking the rain from his coat, and demanding, almost before he had seated himself, a full account of what Holmes had thus far uncovered. Poison, you say? This aconitane business? And a false name in the apothecary's ledger? Lestrade's sharp eyes narrowed with professional interest as Holmes laid out, in careful and economical terms, the essential facts of the case thus far assembled. That is a serious matter indeed, Mr. Holmes, if it holds up under proper examination, but I'll tell you plainly, it's a long road yet from a poisoned cup and a foreign servant's false name to a conviction that will satisfy a jury. You'll want more than suspicion and clever tasting of old tea leaves before this goes to trial. I am well aware of the evidentiary standard required, Lestrade, and I do not intend to rest upon suspicion alone, Holmes replied, with more patience than I had sometimes seen him extend to the inspector's characteristic bluntness. I have sent a scraping of the residue to Maidstone for proper chemical analysis, which should confirm or refute my own observation within a day or two. I have established, through independent witnesses, that the deceased was engaged in secret correspondence with a solicitor named Ashworth regarding some matter of money, and I have reason to believe that Sir Edmund Blackwood's own fortune, and indeed his very identity and history, may bear rather more scrutiny than the coroner's inquest thought fit to give them. His identity, Mr. Holmes? You suspect the man is not who he claims to be. I suspect a great many things, Lestrade, most of which I am not yet prepared to state as settled fact. But consider this. A man returns from many years abroad, India, South America, by his own account, to claim an inheritance following his elder brother's death at sea, a death for which, so far as I can determine, there exists no body, no independent witness beyond the ship's own manifest, and no evidence, save Sir Edmund's word, and whatever documentation he chose to present to the family solicitors at the time. He arrives home a wealthy man, by outward appearance, and yet his house falls steadily into disrepair, even as he arranges an advantageous marriage to a country innkeeper's daughter, a marriage, moreover, secured by the forgiveness of a debt rather more valuable to the innkeeper than it seems likely to have been troublesome to a genuinely wealthy man. And now this same daughter, in the final weeks before that marriage, begins secret correspondence with a London solicitor concerning money of her own, and dies suddenly by a rare and deliberately administered poison, purchased under a false name by a servant closely connected to Sir Edmund himself. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingertips pressed together in the manner I knew so well. I do not say these facts prove Sir Edmund a murderer, Lestrade. I say only that they raise questions a competent investigator cannot in conscience leave unanswered. Lestrade was silent for a long moment, chewing thoughtfully upon the end of his moustache, a habit I had observed in him during his more difficult deliberations. You'll want to look into this Ashworth fellow, then, and find out what business he had with the girl. Precisely so, and I intend to travel to London myself tomorrow to do exactly that. In the meantime, Lestrade, I would consider it a great service if you were to remain here in Ashford Mire, ostensibly to review the coroner's original findings in an official capacity, but in fact to keep a discreet watch upon Marchmont Hall and its occupants. I do not wish Sir Edmund to grow alarmed and take some precipitate action before we have gathered evidence sufficient to secure a conviction. You think he might flee? I think a man who has already committed one murder to protect a secret worth killing for will not hesitate to commit a second, should he sense the net closing about him, Holmes said gravely, and I would very much prefer that no further harm should come to anyone in this village before we are able to bring this matter to its proper conclusion. It was an observation that would prove, within the space of a single day, to be prophetic in a manner none of us could then have anticipated. Chapter 9. The Secret Clue. That night, long after the inn had grown quiet and Lestrade had retired to the room Thorn had made up for him, I found Holmes still awake in the small parlour we had been given for our own use, seated before the dying fire, with Rosalind's writing desk blotter spread across his knee, studying it yet again by the light of a single candle. "You have not slept, Holmes," I observed, settling into the chair opposite. "You will wear yourself thin before this case is concluded, and be no use to anyone for it. Sleep can wait, Watson. There is something here that has troubled me since this afternoon, and I find I cannot rest until I have worried it into clarity." He held the blotter up toward the candle flame, angling it this way and that. You will recall I noted the faint impressions of ink upon this blotter, too faint and too fragmentary for ordinary reading. I have spent the better part of an hour attempting to reconstruct them by holding a small mirror to the reversed image, a technique I have found useful upon previous occasions, and I believe I have succeeded in recovering a fragment of some significance. He passed me a sheet of his own notepaper, upon which he had painstakingly copied out, in his own small, precise hand, the fragments he had managed to decipher. I read with growing fascination the broken and incomplete phrases he had assembled. "Confirm the codicil, late mother's trust, upon my 21st birthday, or upon marriage, whichever. Mr. Ashworth assures me the sum exceeds. Must not let S.E.B. learn of this until—" "A trust," I said slowly, "left by her late mother, maturing either upon her 21st birthday or upon marriage, and she was determined that Sir Edmund should not learn of it until some condition she does not specify." "Precisely, Watson. And observe the initials, S.E.B., Sir Edmund Blackwood, beyond any reasonable doubt. Now consider the calendar with me. Rosalind was 19 years of age, as her father told us. Her 21st birthday therefore lay some 2 years distant, too far off to have prompted such urgent secrecy in these final weeks. But her marriage, Watson, was to take place within the fortnight. If this trust matured upon marriage rather than upon age, and if Rosalind had only recently discovered its existence, perhaps through some paper of her late mother's, or through inquiry prompted by her own growing unease regarding the match, then she stood, upon her wedding day, to come into a fortune of her own, a fortune that a solicitor's letter suggested was very considerable indeed. And if the marriage settlement gave Sir Edmund control of his wife's property, as such settlements commonly do, then Sir Edmund Blackwood, upon marrying Rosalind Thorn, would have found himself master not merely of a modest annuity and the forgiveness of an £800 debt, but of a fortune sufficient, perhaps, to restore Marchmont Hall to its former glory and settle whatever other debts I strongly suspect he has accumulated during his long absence abroad. Holmes set down the blotter and stared into the dying embers of the fire, his face grave and thoughtful. "But here is the difficulty that troubles me, Watson, and the reason I have chosen, for the present, to keep this discovery entirely to myself, sharing it with no one save you, in the strictest confidence, not even with Lestrade, not yet. Why ever not, Holmes? Surely this is precisely the evidence of motive that Lestrade said we required. Because, my dear Watson, if this trust matured upon marriage, as I strongly suspect it did, given the urgency of Rosalind's secret correspondence in the final weeks before her wedding day, then Sir Edmund's motive for murder becomes, on the surface, entirely nonsensical. Why should a man kill the very woman whose marriage would deliver a fortune into his hands? He had every reason to see that marriage proceed as swiftly and as smoothly as possible, and every reason in the world to want Rosalind Thorne alive and standing beside him at the altar, not dead in her bed a fortnight before the ceremony could take place. I confess this observation struck me with considerable force, and for a long moment I could find no answer to it. Then perhaps we have been mistaken, Holmes. Perhaps Sir Edmund is innocent after all, and some other party, ignorant of the marriage settlement, sought to prevent Rosalind from ever coming into her inheritance at all, whether she married or not. That is one possibility, certainly, and I have not discounted it entirely. But there is another explanation, Watson, darker and I think more probable, that occurred to me only this past hour, as I sat here turning these fragments over and over in my mind. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes bright with the particular intensity that always marked the moment when the true shape of a case began, at last, to emerge from the fog of scattered fact. What if Sir Edmund did not merely fail to know of this trust in advance, but discovered it only very recently? Discovered, perhaps, that Rosalind had learned something else besides, something concerning the trust's proper administration, or its rightful trustee, or the true circumstances of how it came to be controlled by him at all? What if the letter from Ashworth did not merely inform her of money to come, but revealed some irregularity, some fraud, in how that trust, and perhaps the whole of the Blackwood inheritance besides, had been managed these past 6 years? A woman who discovers her intended husband has been systematically defrauding her, and who intends, upon the very eve of their marriage, to expose that fraud rather than deliver her fortune quietly into his keeping. Such a woman becomes, Watson, not an asset to be married, but a threat to be silenced, and silenced quickly, before her wedding day could ever arrive to make the theft complete and irreversible. I sat back, the full weight of the implication settling over me like a shadow. Then his brother's death at sea may bear rather more scrutiny than a simple accident of storm and misfortune. Yes. I intend to travel to London tomorrow, Watson, to examine the shipping records, the probate documents, and whatever papers Mr. Ashworth's office can be persuaded to share with us regarding the administration of the Thorne, or rather, I suspect, the original family trust. I have a growing conviction that Sir Edmund Blackwood's fortune rests upon a foundation a great deal less solid and a great deal more criminal than mere debt and neglect. But until I have proof, hard proof, that will satisfy a court of law, and not merely my own private conviction, I intend to keep my suspicions close, Watson, even from Lestrade, whose honest bluntness, admirable as it is in its place, would very likely alarm our quarry before we are ready to spring the trap. Chapter 10. Rising Stakes. Holmes's plans for an early departure to London were interrupted, however, by an event that threw the whole village into fresh alarm before the sun had properly risen the following morning. I was woken shortly after 6 by an urgent pounding upon our door, and found Mrs. Weld standing upon the threshold in evident distress, her face white beneath her disordered cap. "Mr. Holmes, doctor, you must come at once. It's Sally, the kitchen girl. She's been found insensible in the inn-yard, struck down and left for dead among the empty barrels, and no one can say how long she's lain there in the cold." We hurried down at once to find the poor girl already carried into the kitchen and laid upon a settle near the fire. Dr. Ferris, summoned in great haste, bent over her with an expression of grave concern. A dark, ugly bruise had risen upon her temple, and though she breathed still, her breathing was shallow, and her eyes remained closed. "A blow to the head, delivered with some considerable force," Dr. Ferris said, straightening at last. "She has not regained consciousness, and I cannot yet say how serious the injury may prove. She was found, I understand, at the foot of the yard wall, near the gate that leads out onto the Marchmont Road." Holmes knelt beside the settle and examined, with characteristic thoroughness, the girl's hands, her clothing, and the ground near where she had fallen, before turning his attention to the small kitchen garden that bordered the yard. "There are footprints here, Watson, quite fresh, in the soft earth beneath the garden wall, a man's boot, and a heavy one, not the light shoe of a village lad. The prints lead from the wall itself, where I judge a man might easily have climbed over from the lane beyond, directly to the spot where Sally was found, and then away again toward the same point of entry. He rose, brushing the earth from his knees, his face set in grim lines I had rarely seen upon it. Someone came here in the night, Watson, specifically to silence this girl, and I fear I know precisely why. Because of what she told us yesterday, I said, the realization striking me with sudden horror. The foreign gentleman she saw visiting Rosalind, Raphael, or Delgado, whichever name he truly answers to. If word reached Marchmont Hall that she had spoken to us of it, then someone at that house grew sufficiently alarmed to attempt her permanent silence, yes. This is precisely the escalation I feared last evening, though I confess I did not anticipate it would come so swiftly, nor strike so close to this house. Holmes's jaw tightened. It confirms, if confirmation were still required, that we are dealing with a party both ruthless and growing desperate, a combination that renders them considerably more dangerous, Watson, for a desperate man makes mistakes, but a desperate and ruthless man makes them while also becoming more willing to strike again. Lestrade, roused by the commotion, arrived within minutes and took charge of the immediate practicalities with his customary brisk efficiency, dispatching a constable to examine the footprints before they could be trampled or washed away by the morning's threatening rain, and arranging for Sally to be moved, once she was fit to travel, to the small cottage hospital in the neighbouring town where she might receive proper care. "This changes matters considerably, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade said, drawing Holmes aside once the immediate crisis had been addressed. "An attempted murder upon English soil, within my own jurisdiction now that I am here, is a rather more pressing matter than a coroner's questionable verdict upon a death 3 days gone. I am inclined to go up to that house directly and demand an accounting from Sir Edmund and this valet of his, here and now." "I would counsel strongly against it, Lestrade," Holmes said, with an urgency that gave the inspector visible pause. "Consider, we have as yet no proof whatsoever connecting anyone at Marchmont Hall to this assault upon Sally, beyond a set of footprints that any competent lawyer would argue could belong to a dozen men in the county. If we confront Sir Edmund now, prematurely, with suspicion alone, we accomplish nothing save to warn him that we are close upon his trail, and give him every opportunity to destroy whatever evidence remains, or to flee the country entirely, with whatever fortune he has already secreted away. I ask you to trust me a little longer, Lestrade. Give me this one day in London to secure the documentary proof that will make our case unassailable, and I promise you a resolution to this whole sorry business within 48 hours. Lestrade chewed upon his moustache a long moment, plainly torn between his own instinct for direct action and his grudging respect for Holmes' judgment, built up over years of collaboration that had, more often than not, vindicated exactly this sort of patient, methodical approach. 48 hours, Mr. Holmes, and not an hour more, he said at last. But I'll have a constable posted at this inn day and night until this matter is settled, and another watching the Marchmont Road besides. If anyone from that house so much as steps outside its gates with a travelling bag in hand, I want to know of it within the hour. An entirely sensible precaution, and one I welcome heartily, Holmes said with evident relief. Watson, we have a train to catch. I believe there is one departing within the hour that will see us in London well before noon, and I have a very great deal to accomplish before this day is out. A visit to Somerset House to examine certain probate and shipping records, and, I hope, an interview with Mr. Ashworth himself, if I can persuade him to receive 2 strangers upon so short and urgent a notice. Chapter 11. The Solicitor's Office. Mr. Ashworth proved to be a small, precise man of late middle age, with the cautious, measured manner common to solicitors of long standing, and he received us in his chambers off Chancery Lane with evident reluctance once Holmes's card had been sent up, accompanied by a brief note explaining the urgency of our business. I must tell you at the outset, Mr. Holmes, that a solicitor's confidence toward his client does not lapse merely because that client has died, Ashworth said, seating himself behind a desk piled high with tied bundles of papers. I am willing to hear what you have to say, but I make no promise of assistance beyond what my professional obligations permit. I quite understand and respect your position entirely, Holmes replied. Let me put the matter to you plainly, and you may judge for yourself where your obligations lie. Rosalind Thorne did not die by her own hand, Mr. Ashworth. Whatever the coroner's jury may have concluded, she was murdered, deliberately and with considerable cunning, by poison. And I believe, though I cannot yet prove it beyond doubt, that her murder is connected directly to the very matter upon which she engaged your services these past weeks. If I am correct, then your continued silence, however proper in the ordinary course of your profession, serves only to protect the man who killed her from the justice he so richly deserves. Ashworth's composed features underwent a visible transformation at this, the careful reserve of the professional man giving way quite suddenly to something rawer and more human. Murdered, he repeated softly. I confess, Mr. Holmes, I had wondered. When the notice of her death reached me, so soon after our final correspondence, I felt a disquiet I could not entirely rationalize away. Very well. I shall tell you what I know, and trust to your discretion in how it is used. He rose and crossed to a heavy safe set into the wall behind his desk, from which he withdrew, after some moments' search, a thick folder of documents, which he laid upon the desk between us. Rosalind Thorne's late mother, Elizabeth Thorne, born Elizabeth Blackwood, I should note, for she was herself a cousin of the Marchmont Blackwoods before her marriage to Josiah Thorne, inherited, upon the death of her own father some 30 years ago, a considerable trust, held in her name, and, upon her death, to pass to her only child, to be released either upon that child's 21st birthday or upon marriage, whichever should occur first, under the trusteeship of the senior surviving male relative of the Blackwood line. And the senior surviving male relative, following the death of Captain Blackwood at sea 6 years past, would be Sir Edmund Blackwood, precisely. He has administered the trust in his capacity as trustee these past 6 years, since his brother's death, and I confess, Mr. Holmes, that when Rosalind first came to me some 2 months ago, having discovered, quite by accident, a bundle of her late mother's papers referencing the trust's existence, of which she had previously known nothing whatsoever, I undertook, at her request, a review of the trust's accounts as they stood. And what did that review reveal? Ashworth's expression grew grim. A very considerable discrepancy, Mr. Holmes. The trust, as established 30 years ago, was valued at some £12,000, invested soundly in consols and railway shares. As of my review 2 months past, the documented value remaining stood at little more than 3,000, a shortfall of some £9,000, systematically withdrawn over the past 6 years under Sir Edmund's trusteeship, through a series of transactions dressed up as investment losses and administrative expenses that would not, I am quite certain, survive close examination by a competent accountant. In short, Mr. Holmes, Sir Edmund Blackwood has been quietly embezzling his own ward's inheritance for the whole period of his trusteeship, and had, I believe, very nearly exhausted what remained of it by the time Rosalind discovered the trust's existence at all. And upon her marriage, or upon her 21st birthday, whichever came first, the trust would have passed formally into her own control, at which point any competent solicitor engaged on her behalf would very quickly have uncovered the fraud. Precisely so. I advised her, when she first consulted me, to proceed with great caution, to say nothing to Sir Edmund of her discovery until we had gathered sufficient documentation to bring the matter before the Court of Chancery with certainty of success, for an accusation of this magnitude, unsupported by ironclad proof, risks nothing so much as alerting the guilty party to destroy what evidence remains before it can be properly examined. I sent her my final report and recommendation not 10 days before her death, urging her to postpone the marriage, if she could contrive some pretext for delay, until the matter could be resolved through proper legal channels. He passed a hand across his brow, visibly shaken by the implications of his own account. "I did not think, Mr. Holmes, I did not for one moment imagine that Sir Edmund would resort to murder rather than face exposure and disgrace. Had I foreseen such a possibility, I should have urged her far more strongly to place herself under some manner of protection. You could not have known, Mr. Ashworth, and your caution in gathering proof before acting was entirely sound counsel. Under ordinary circumstances," Holmes said, gathering the documents before him with evident satisfaction, though his face remained grave. "The fault, if fault there is to be assigned beyond the murderer himself, lies with a man who found, in a marriage he had arranged to complete his theft entirely and place it forever beyond discovery, only the certainty of imminent exposure instead, and chose murder as the surest means of silencing the one voice that might have condemned him. May I take copies of these documents with me to Kent? I believe they will prove the final and decisive piece in a case that is very nearly, though not quite, complete. Take the originals, Mr. Holmes, and my own sworn statement besides, if it will help bring that man to justice. I owe that poor girl at least so much, for trusting her affairs into my keeping and receiving, in return, only a solicitor's caution where perhaps a more urgent warning was required. Chapter 12. A Grave Reopened. From Chancery Lane we proceeded directly to Somerset House, where Holmes, drawing upon an acquaintance of long standing among the registry clerks, secured access to the probate records concerning the estate of the late Captain Henry Blackwood, with a speed that would have taken any ordinary applicant the better part of a week to achieve. "Here," said Holmes, after some 20 minutes' careful search among the bound volumes, "is the record of probate, granted some 6 years past, upon the strength of a certificate of death issued by the British consul at Bahia, in Brazil, and a sworn deposition from the master of the vessel, Esperanza, one Captain Vicente Alves, attesting that Henry Blackwood was lost overboard during a storm off that coast. His body never recovered." "That seems straightforward enough, does it not?" I said, though I confess something in Holmes's tone suggested he had found more in the document than its plain wording conveyed. "Straightforward, Watson, save for one small but significant particular. Observe the date of this deposition, filed some 4 months after the storm it describes, and sworn not before a magistrate in Brazil, where the loss is said to have occurred, but before a notary in Lisbon, Portugal, a considerable distance removed from the scene of the alleged tragedy. And observe further," he traced the document with his finger, "that the witnessing notary's name, one Senhor Duarte Delgado, bears a striking similarity to the surname our friend the apothecary recorded in his ledger for the purchaser of the aconitine." I felt a chill pass through me at this revelation. "You believe the valet Raphael and this notary are connected, perhaps even related?" "I believe it is a coincidence too great to credit, Watson, and I intend to telegraph a contact of mine in Lisbon this very afternoon to inquire further into the character and history of Senhor Duarte Delgado, and whether he numbers among his relations a younger man who might, 6 years later, be found serving as valet to the very party who benefited so conveniently from the death he helped attest." Holmes closed the heavy volume with a soft thud. "But there is a simpler explanation still worth considering, Watson, and I confess it is the one toward which my own suspicions increasingly incline. What if Captain Henry Blackwood did not die at sea at all?" I stared at him. "You mean to suggest the death was entirely fabricated? But to what possible purpose? Surely Sir Edmund benefited from his brother's death, not the reverse. Consider the sequence of events with fresh eyes, Watson. A younger son, long resident abroad, engaged in business of uncertain character in South America. Business that may, I strongly suspect, have brought him into contact with men skilled in the production of false papers and the purchase of convenient testimony. An elder brother, presumably the rightful heir to Marchmont Hall, inconveniently standing between that younger son and a fortune, however diminished, that would otherwise never fall within his reach. A storm at sea provides the perfect cover for a disappearance that need never have involved an actual death at all. Merely a change of name, a change of country, and the patient cultivation, over some months, of the documentary evidence required to establish a death that a British consul, presented with sufficiently convincing papers from a respectable-seeming source, would have little cause to question. You believe, then, that the man calling himself Sir Edmund Blackwood is not Sir Edmund at all, but Captain Henry Blackwood himself, returned under an assumed identity to claim an inheritance that was never rightfully his to claim. I believe it is a possibility we cannot afford to dismiss, though I hold it still provisionally, pending further confirmation. Recall Mrs. Weld's remark that Sir Edmund returned from his years abroad, greatly changed in appearance, sun-darkened, aged beyond his years by hardship, so that even old acquaintances of the family found him altered almost beyond easy recognition. Recall, too, that no likeness of either brother, so far as we have yet discovered, survives from before their years of separation, the family portraits at Marchmont Hall depicting only earlier generations. A man returning after long years abroad, sufficiently changed by climate and circumstance, claiming to be the younger brother rather than the elder, would face remarkably little practical obstacle to the deception, provided the true younger brother's death, or complicity, could be satisfactorily arranged, and provided no inconvenient witness from the family's earlier years remained close at hand to raise awkward questions. The implications of this theory, monstrous as they seemed, settled over me with the particular horror of a puzzle whose pieces, however improbable individually, fit together with terrible completeness once properly arranged. Then the man at Marchmont Hall may not merely be a fraud and a murderer, Holmes, but may have begun his career of deception with the death, real or contrived, of his own brother. It is a hypothesis only, Watson, and I do not intend to state it as established fact until I have secured more definite proof. But it would explain a great deal that has otherwise puzzled me. The man's evident unfamiliarity, upon his return, with certain small domestic details that a true son of the house might be expected to recall. His marked discomfort whenever the subject of his brother's death arises in conversation, and above all, his desperate need for ready money, a need far more consistent with a man maintaining an elaborate and costly deception across many years than with a legitimate heir enjoying an inheritance honestly come by. Holmes gathered his notes and rose from the long reading table. Come, Watson. I have one further call to make before we return to Kent. A visit to the shipping office that handled the Esperanza's original manifest to inquire whether any passenger by the name of Henry Blackwood, or indeed any Englishman answering to his description, disembarked at any port along that vessel's final voyage before the storm that supposedly claimed his life. Chapter 9. The Valet's Confession. The shipping office yielded one final, crucial fact before we caught the evening train back into Kent. A passenger list confirming that a Mr. H. Blackwood had indeed booked passage aboard the Esperanza's outward voyage from Southampton, but that the return manifest, filed some weeks before the storm that supposedly claimed him, recorded no such name among those who had disembarked at any intermediate port, save for a curious notation, made in the clerk's own hand, that a first-class passenger had transferred at Lisbon to a coastal vessel bound for England, travelling under the name of E. Blackwood, some 4 months before the elder brother's reported death at sea. There, Watson, Holmes said grimly, as our train rattled southward through the darkening countryside, is the final thread that binds the whole sorry tapestry together. Henry Blackwood, the true elder brother, the rightful heir, appears to have quietly assumed his younger brother's identity and returned to England some 4 months before the death that was subsequently reported, while the true Edmund, I greatly fear, met an end we may never be able to establish with certainty, somewhere upon that South American coast, his absence subsequently explained away by a storm that never claimed the life the family believed it had. We arrived back at the Gilded Swan well past 10 o'clock to find the inn in a state of hushed but unmistakable tension. Lestrade met us at the door, his face grave. "There's been a development, Mr. Holmes, while you were away. The valet, Raphael, or Delgado, whichever name suits him, was seen this evening slipping away from Marchmont Hall on foot, taking the footpath toward the coast road rather than the main highway, as though he meant to avoid observation. I had a constable follow him at a discreet distance, and he was taken into custody not 2 hours past, attempting to purchase passage on a fishing vessel bound for the French coast, with rather more gold sewn into the lining of his coat than an honest servant's wages could readily explain. Excellent work, Lestrade. Better than I dared hope for. Where is he now? In the cells at the county police station, and refusing to say a word beyond his own name, which he gives, somewhat defiantly, as Rafael Delgado. Holmes wasted no time in making his way to the small county station, where the valet sat sullen and silent behind iron bars, his dark eyes flickering with something between defiance and fear as Holmes approached and drew a chair close to the cell door. "Senor Delgado," Holmes began, in a tone of quiet, deliberate calm, "I have this day examined the probate records concerning the death of Captain Henry Blackwood at sea, and I have found, among the witnesses to the sworn deposition establishing that death, a notary of Lisbon by the name of Duarte Delgado. Your father, I would imagine, or perhaps an uncle. I have also examined the shipping manifests, which reveal a curious transfer of passengers at that same port, some months before the reported tragedy. I tell you this, Senhor Delgado, not to alarm you unduly, but so that you may understand precisely how much I already know, and thereby judge for yourself how little is served by your continued silence, save the protection of a man who has shown himself entirely willing to see you hang for a murder that was, I strongly suspect, not originally of your own devising." For a long moment the valet said nothing at all, his jaw working silently, his eyes fixed upon some point beyond Holmes's shoulder. Then, quite suddenly, something in his composure broke, and the words came in a rush, low and bitter, in accented but perfectly comprehensible English. "He promised me a share, senor, a share of the fortune, once it was safely his, in payment for what my family had already done, to help him to his brother's name and title. My father provided the false papers, the testimony that a British consul, eager to close a tiresome file, was glad enough to accept without excessive scrutiny. I came to England as his servant, to help him maintain the deception, and for 6 years I have watched him grow more desperate, as the money he stole ran out faster than he could replace it, through his brother's fortune alone." "And the poison?" Holmes asked, very quietly. "He came to me 2 weeks past, senor, in a state I had never before seen him, pale, sweating, half mad with fear. He had learned, from a letter he intercepted before it reached the girl, that her solicitor had uncovered the theft from her trust, and that she meant to expose him rather than proceed with a marriage she had come to suspect was built upon fraud. He told me the marriage could no longer save him, that once her lawyer's evidence reached the proper authorities, whether she married him or not, his ruin was certain, for the trust's shortfall alone would be enough to see him imprisoned, quite apart from whatever else might be uncovered concerning his brother's true fate. He said there was only one course left that might yet save us both, for by then, senor, I was as deeply implicated in his crimes as he was himself, and had as much to lose from exposure as he did. He instructed me to purchase the aconitine, and told me he would see to its administration himself, through the girl's own nightly tea, upon a night when I had provided him a certified alibi at the hall. I did not administer the poison myself, senor. I swear it upon my mother's grave, but I purchased it, and I knew full well the use to which it would be put, and for that I do not ask forgiveness, only that the court should know it was he, not I, who mixed that fatal dose and forced it, by whatever means, into that poor girl's cup." "And the attack upon the servant girl at the inn, Sally?" Delgado's face went, if possible, even paler. "That was his doing also, senor, done with his own hand while I kept watch at the garden wall, for he grew convinced she had seen and heard too much, and might yet identify me to your satisfaction. I begged him to leave her be, that violence upon violence would only draw the very scrutiny he most feared. But he was past all reason by then, senor, a man drowning, who will drag down anyone within reach rather than sink alone." Holmes rose slowly from his chair, his face set in lines of grim satisfaction, mingled with a deep and evident anger. "Thank you, Senor Delgado. Your confession, given freely and without inducement, will be recorded and presented to the court, and I would advise you, when the time comes, to repeat it in precisely these terms before a magistrate, for it is, I believe, the surest path remaining to you toward whatever mercy the law may yet extend." He turned to Lestrade, who had listened to the entire exchange with an expression of grim, satisfied attention. "We have our murderer named beyond all doubt, Lestrade, though the man who wears the name of Sir Edmund Blackwood remains, for the present, entirely ignorant of how close the net has drawn about him. I propose we keep it that way one day longer, and use that ignorance to secure his capture, beyond any possibility of legal escape." Chapter 14. Holmes's Strategic Play. "The difficulty that remains, Watson," Holmes said, as we walked back through the sleeping village toward the Gilded Swan in the small hours of the morning, "is that Delgado's confession, however damning, is the testimony of an accomplice, and no English court will convict a man of murder upon such testimony alone, unsupported by independent corroboration. We have motive in the fraud uncovered by Mr. Ashworth. We have opportunity, established well enough by the thread of silk and the footprints beneath the window. But we lack the one thing that would place this matter beyond any possibility of doubt or acquittal: direct evidence connecting the man himself to the act, or to some admission of guilt from his own lips, given freely and without the taint of duress." "How do you propose to obtain such a thing, Holmes? He has shown himself far too careful, far too composed, to simply confess before witnesses." "A careful man, Watson, is careful only so long as he believes his secrets remain secure. Remove that belief, suddenly and convincingly, and even the most composed criminal will often act with a haste and a carelessness that his ordinary caution would never permit." Holmes drew from his coat pocket the small brown bottle he had procured from the apothecary 2 days before. The harmless preparation of chalk and coloured water he had declined, at the time, to explain. "I propose, Watson, to convince Sir Edmund, or Captain Blackwood, as we must now more properly call him, that Rosalind did not destroy every trace of her correspondence with Mr. Ashworth, as he no doubt believes, but left behind a final letter hidden somewhere within her chamber, naming him explicitly as the author of the fraud she had discovered, and stating her intention to carry that evidence to the authorities within days of her death, whatever the risk to herself." "But no such letter exists, Holmes. You have told me yourself that her final drafts were all destroyed." "No such letter exists at present, Watson, which is precisely why I intend to write one myself, in a hand closely approximating her own, drawing upon the samples I have gathered from her surviving correspondence, and to arrange, through a discreet word to the local newspaper editor, an acquaintance of mine from a previous case, who owes me a favour he will be glad to repay, that a small notice appears in tomorrow's edition, reporting that new evidence has come to light in the Thorn inquest, evidence found concealed within the deceased's own chamber, which the coroner's office intends to examine further before determining whether the case should be reopened as a matter of suspected foul play." I confess I felt a certain unease at this plan, ingenious as it undoubtedly was. "Is this not a considerable risk, Holmes? If he suspects the notice to be a fabrication—" "He will not suspect it, Watson, because I intend to plant the bottle you see here, filled, as it appears, with a tincture bearing every outward resemblance to a preparation of aconitine, in a place where his own search, prompted by that newspaper notice, will discover it, alongside a fragment of paper bearing, in Rosalind's own hand as nearly as I can reproduce it, a partial account of his fraud, and a promise that the full truth lies elsewhere, safely lodged with a solicitor who will act upon it should any harm befall her. A guilty man, Watson, confronted with evidence that appears to prove his crime, has already been partially uncovered, and that further exposure is imminent and unstoppable, does not generally pause to question his good fortune in finding it before the authorities do. He acts, swiftly, and in ways that a calm and rational man would never permit himself. The plan, audacious as it was, proceeded very much as Holmes had foreseen. The newspaper notice appeared the following morning, artfully vague in its particulars yet unmistakably alarming in its implication, and by that same evening Holmes had contrived, through a private word with Mrs. Weld, to ensure that Rosalind's chamber, still nominally sealed pending the coroner's further inquiry, should stand unguarded and unwatched for a critical hour after nightfall, its window left deliberately, invitingly, unlatched. "He will come tonight, Watson," Holmes said, as we took up our concealed position in the shadow of the stable block across the inn yard, from which we commanded a clear view of both the window and the garden wall beyond. A man in his position cannot afford to wait upon the coroner's leisure to discover whatever evidence that notice describes. He must find it first and destroy it, before official eyes ever fall upon it. Lestrade has 2 constables posted at the front of the inn and along the coast road, in the event our quarry attempts flight, rather than confrontation. All that remains now, my dear Watson, is patience, the one virtue upon which every successful conclusion to a case of this nature ultimately depends. Chapter 15. The Night Watch. The hours crept by with a slowness that tested even Holmes's famous patience. The 2 of us crouched in the cold shadow of the stable, our breath fogging faintly in the chill night air, while the inn behind us grew dark window by window as its ordinary occupants retired for the night. A church clock somewhere beyond the green struck 11, and then the half-hour, and I had begun to wonder whether Holmes's careful reasoning had, for once, misjudged its quarry, when a soft sound from the direction of the garden wall brought us both instantly alert. A dark figure dropped lightly over the low wall, moving with the careful, practiced silence of a man accustomed to unseen movement, and made his way swiftly across the garden toward the drain-pipe beneath Rosalind's window. The same route, I realized with a chill, that had first been suggested by the thread of green silk Holmes had discovered caught upon the latch. "There," Holmes breathed, scarcely above a whisper. "Watch, Watson, and say nothing until I give the word." We watched in tense silence as the figure climbed with surprising agility for a man of his years, gained the window ledge, and disappeared within, a faint gleam of candlelight flickering briefly against the glass as he began his search. Some 5 minutes passed, minutes that seemed to stretch into hours, before Holmes touched my arm and rose silently from our concealment. "Now, Watson, quietly, if you please, and keep close behind me." We crossed the yard with careful, deliberate steps, and had very nearly gained the foot of the stair within the inn itself, when a sudden crash from above told us that our quarry had discovered the planted evidence, and had reacted, precisely as Holmes had predicted, with something considerably less than calm composure. We took the narrow stair 2 steps at a time and burst into Rosalind's chamber to find the man calling himself Sir Edmund Blackwood standing frozen beside the writing desk, the false bottle shattered upon the floor at his feet, the forged fragment of paper crumpled in one trembling hand, his face, in the light of his own candle, a mask of such naked terror and fury as I had rarely seen upon any man. "Good evening, Captain Blackwood," Holmes said, his voice cutting through the sudden, terrible silence like a blade. "For that is your true name, is it not? Henry Blackwood, elder brother to the man whose identity you assumed some 6 years past, following whatever fate you arranged for the true Edmund upon that South American coast." For one long, dreadful moment, the man said nothing at all, his eyes darting between Holmes and myself and the open window behind him, calculating, I could see, whether flight remained a possibility. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, he lunged not toward the window but toward Holmes himself, the candlestick raised as a weapon in his free hand, and I had scarcely time to cry out a warning before Holmes, with the quick, trained economy of movement that had served him in 100 such encounters, caught the descending arm and turned the man's own momentum against him, sending him crashing heavily against the washstand, the candle guttering and very nearly extinguished in the struggle. I sprang forward to assist, and between the 2 of us we had the man pinned and subdued within moments, though he fought with the desperate, wordless ferocity of a creature that knows itself finally, irrevocably cornered. It was Lestrade's timely arrival, summoned by the sound of the struggle and by the prearranged signal of a lantern held to the window, that finally brought the confrontation to its close, the inspector himself producing a pair of handcuffs with grim satisfaction as two constables secured our prisoner between them. "Henry Blackwood," Lestrade said formally, once the man had been hauled upright and stood, chest heaving, his composure entirely shattered at last. "Alias Sir Edmund Blackwood, I am arresting you upon suspicion of the wilful murder of Rosalind Thorne, and upon such further charges as may be brought regarding fraud, forgery, and the assault of one Sally Higgins, servant of this establishment. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be taken down and used in evidence against you." The man's eyes, wild and desperate a moment before, seemed suddenly to empty of all fight entirely, replaced by something closer to exhausted despair. He looked, for one brief moment, directly at Holmes, and when he spoke at last, his voice was low and bitter, stripped of every trace of the cultivated charm he had worn so carefully throughout our previous encounters. "How long have you known?" he asked simply. "Since this very afternoon, with certainty," Holmes replied, not unkindly, though there was no softness in his eyes. "I have suspected some manner of imposture since our first meeting, Captain Blackwood, for a genuinely grieving bridegroom does not answer questions about his own brother's death with quite such practiced evasion. But suspicion is not proof, and it has taken these past 3 days to assemble proof sufficient to bring you to precisely this moment." "She would have ruined me," the man said, and I heard in his voice, beneath the bitterness, something that might almost have been a plea for understanding, however undeserved. "Everything I built these 6 years, everything I risked, everything I sacrificed to claim what I believed, in some measure, was owed to me after a lifetime spent in my brother's shadow. She would have torn it all down with one letter to a magistrate, and thought nothing of the ruin it would bring upon me, upon Delgado, upon everyone who had helped me toward this life. She would have brought a thief and a murderer to justice, Captain Blackwood," Holmes said quietly, "which is rather more than can be said in your own defence. Take him away, Lestrade. I believe our business here, for tonight at least, is very nearly concluded." Chapter 16. The Reveal. The following afternoon, at Holmes's particular request, a small gathering assembled in the private parlour of the Gilded Swan. Josiah Thorne and his sister Mrs. Weld, pale but composed, Tom Hargrave, summoned from the forge, his face taut with anxious hope, Dr. Ferris, whose chemical analysis had arrived from Maidstone that very morning, confirming beyond any scientific doubt the presence of aconitine in the residue Holmes had gathered from that fatal cup, and Lestrade, standing near the door with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose case, however much credit others might claim for its solution, would nonetheless close with a conviction to his name. "I promised you the truth, Mr. Thorne," Holmes began, once all were settled, however hard a thing it might prove to bear, "and I believe it only right that you should hear the whole of it laid out plainly, that no doubt or rumour may trouble you in the years to come." He proceeded, then, to lay before them the entire chain of reasoning we had followed these past 4 days, the false laudanum bottle standing beside a cup whose true poison spoke a different, deadlier language upon the tongue, the thread of green silk caught upon a latch that told of a climber where all had assumed a woman alone, the ledger entry in a foreign hand, purchasing death under a stranger's borrowed name, the fragments recovered from a blotter that spoke of a trust, a solicitor, and a secret her murderer could not permit her to keep, the shipping manifests and probate records that revealed, at the very foundation of the tragedy, an imposture 6 years in the making, built upon a brother's disappearance and a fortune never rightfully claimed. "You mean to say," Thorne said slowly, when Holmes had finished, his weathered face working with an emotion too complex for any single name, "that the man my Rosalind was to marry was not even the man he claimed to be, that his very name was a lie, built upon the ruin of his own brother, before ever he set his sights upon ruining my daughter besides?" "I do, Mr. Thorne," though I would offer what small comfort I can in saying this. Your daughter's death, terrible as it was, came about not through any weakness or failing of her own, but through her courage. She discovered a fraud that a lesser spirit might have chosen to overlook for the sake of a comfortable marriage and a settled future. She chose instead to pursue the truth at whatever cost, and it was precisely that courage, that refusal to accept a comfortable lie over an uncomfortable truth, which marked her, in the end, for murder. You told me yourself, upon our very first meeting, that she was not a coward. You were entirely right, Mr. Thorne, and I hope it may bring you some measure of peace, in time, to know that she died not in despair, but in the very act of seeking justice for a wrong done to her mother's memory and to herself. Mrs. Weld had begun to weep quietly, though I fancied there was relief mingled with her grief. The terrible uncertainty of these past days finally resolved into a sorrow that, however painful, could at least be understood, and in time, endured. Tom Hargrave said nothing at all, but I saw his jaw work silently, his eyes bright with tears he plainly refused to let fall before company, and I thought of his fierce words at the forge 2 days past, that he would find his own way to make Sir Edmund answer, whatever it cost him, and was glad, deeply glad, that Holmes's patient methods had rendered any such desperate reckoning unnecessary. "What will become of him now, Mr. Holmes?" Dr. Ferris asked, folding away the chemical report he had brought with such evident distress. "He will stand trial for murder, Doctor, upon evidence that I believe leaves no reasonable avenue of acquittal open to him. The chemical analysis you have yourself confirmed. The testimony of his own accomplice, corroborated in every particular by the documentary evidence Mr. Ashworth has placed at the court's disposal, and, not least, his own words and actions upon the night of his capture, which any competent counsel will find exceedingly difficult to explain away as the conduct of an innocent man. The question of his true identity, and whatever fate befell the true Edmund Blackwood upon that distant coast, will doubtless occupy the courts and the Foreign Office a good while longer, but I do not think, Mr. Thorne, that any of us here need trouble ourselves further with that particular reckoning. Justice, so far as English law can render it, will be done for Rosalind, and that, I think, is the matter that has brought us all together this afternoon." "And Delgado, the valet?" Lestrade asked. "He'll turn King's evidence, I expect, given the confession he's already made." "I should think it very likely, and I would counsel the prosecution toward whatever leniency his cooperation may fairly earn him, for he was, in the truest sense, as much a victim of Captain Blackwood's schemes as anyone else in this sorry affair, drawn into crimes not entirely of his own devising, by a family obligation and a promised reward that proved, in the end, as false as everything else that man ever offered to those who trusted him." Holmes rose from his chair, gathering his notes together with the brisk, businesslike air that always signalled, in my experience, the natural conclusion of a case. "I believe, Mr. Thorne, that I have discharged the commission you brought to Baker Street 4 days ago. You asked for the truth, however hard it might prove, and I have given you the truth entire, so far as human investigation can ever hope to recover it. I am sorry only that it could not also give you back your daughter." Chapter Text. Aftermath. The weeks that followed brought their own quiet reckonings to Ashford-Mire, as such matters generally do once the drama of arrest and confrontation has faded into the slower, less romantic business of courts and depositions. The man who had called himself Sir Edmund Blackwood was removed to await trial at the county assizes, where, some months later, Holmes informed me by letter, he was convicted upon the fullest weight of evidence and sentenced to hang for his crime, a sentence he met, by all accounts, with the same cold composure that had first struck me as false during our initial interview at Marchmont Hall, as though even at the very end he could not entirely abandon the performance that had sustained his 6 years of borrowed identity. Rafael Delgado, true to Holmes's prediction, gave evidence for the Crown and received, in consequence, a considerably lighter sentence of penal transportation, his cooperation weighed by the court against the genuine, if reluctant, part he had played in his master's schemes. Marchmont Hall itself passed, in the absence of any legitimate heir once the fraud was fully unravelled, into the hands of the Court of Chancery, and was sold, some months later, to a prosperous wool merchant from Maidstone, who had no connection whatsoever to the Blackwood name, a resolution that seemed to me, when Holmes related it, a fitting enough end for a house whose recent history had been built upon so thorough and so ruinous a deception. Sally Higgins, the servant girl whose assault had so nearly added a second tragedy to the case, made a full recovery within a fortnight, though she carried, I understand, a small pale scar above her temple for the rest of her days, as quiet testament to the danger she had unwittingly courted, through nothing more than an honest answer to an honest question. Josiah Thorne saw to it, in gratitude, that she should never want for a position at the Gilded Swan for as long as she cared to remain there. As for Tom Hargrave, I was glad to learn, some year or so after the case had closed, that he had married a farmer's daughter from a neighbouring parish, and that though he never spoke of Rosalind Thorne to strangers, those who knew him well understood that a small, private grief for the girl he had loved as a boy would remain with him, quietly, for the whole of his life, not a wound that festered, but one that had, in time, become simply a part of the man he had grown to be. Mr. Ashworth's diligent work in tracing the remnants of the embezzled trust succeeded in recovering a portion of what had been stolen, not the full £9,000, for a good deal had been irrecoverably spent in the maintenance of the false Sir Edmund's expensive deceptions, but enough, when added to what remained of the estate's liquidation, to clear Josiah Thorne's original debt upon the Gilded Swan several times over, and to leave him, for the first time in many years, a man free of financial anxiety, however little comfort that freedom could offer, against the loss that had purchased it. I confess that I found myself, in the months that followed, thinking often of Rosalind Thorne, a young woman I had never known in life, who existed for me only through the careful, patient reconstruction of clues and testimony that Holmes had assembled with such extraordinary skill, and yet who had come, by the case's conclusion, to seem almost as vivid and real to me as any living acquaintance. There was something in her quiet, determined courage. A girl of 19, alone against a fraud and a fortune far beyond her worldly experience, choosing truth over comfortable silence though it should cost her everything, that struck me as worthy of rather more than the brief sensational notice the London papers gave her story before moving on, as papers always do, to fresher scandals and newer tragedies. "You are unusually pensive this evening, Watson," Holmes remarked one night, some weeks after our return to Baker Street, as I sat by the fire with my pipe long since gone cold in my hand. "I was thinking of Rosalind Thorne," I admitted. "It seems a hard thing, Holmes, that courage such as hers should end in nothing more than a country churchyard and a paragraph in the evening papers." Holmes was silent a long moment, his eyes upon the fire, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost, for once, its usual brisk detachment. "It ends in rather more than that, Watson, though I grant the world at large will never trouble itself to notice it. It ends in a father free of debt, a servant girl spared further harm, an old solicitor's professional conscience, honoured rather than betrayed, and a fraud 6 years in the building brought, at last, to justice. That is no small legacy for a girl of 19 to leave behind her, however brief and however cruelly cut short her own life may have been. I have long observed, Watson, that the world remembers loudly those who commit great crimes, and forgets, all too quickly, those whose quiet courage first brought such crimes to light. It is, I think, one of the very few injustices that even our combined efforts can never entirely set right. Chapter 10. A final word. I said nothing further that evening, for there seemed nothing more worth saying, and we sat together in companionable silence as the fire burned low and the lamps of Baker Street began, one by one, to glow through the thinning fog outside our window. It was Holmes himself who broke the silence at last, rising to fetch his violin from its accustomed corner, though he did not immediately play. "You will write of this case, I expect, Watson, In that romantic fashion you cannot seem to help, whatever protests I make against it. I had thought of it, yes, I admitted, though I confess I hardly know how to do justice to it. There is too much sorrow in it for the sort of tale that ends neatly upon the final page. Most true stories do not end neatly, Watson. It is only in fiction that villains are invariably clever and victims invariably foolish, and justice arrives always in time to prevent the worst from happening. In life, justice arrives. When it arrives at all, generally too late to undo the harm already done, and must content itself with preventing further harm instead. That is not so poor an achievement as it may sound, though I grant it offers little comfort to a grieving father. He drew the bow across the strings at last, a low, melancholy phrase that seemed, to my ear, to carry something of Rosalind Thorne's own quiet, unfinished courage within it. I do not say this to discourage your writing, Watson. Quite the contrary. I think perhaps the truest service we can render a girl like Rosalind Thorne, beyond the conviction of the man who murdered her, is to ensure that her courage is not forgotten entirely, swallowed up in the general forgetting that time visits upon even the most remarkable among us. Write it plainly, and write it true, and let your readers judge for themselves whether hers was a life well spent, however briefly. I did not answer him directly, but I confess it was in that moment, watching my old friend at his violin, the firelight playing across features that could shift, within a single conversation, from cold analytical brilliance to something very near to genuine feeling, that I resolved fully to set down this account precisely as it had unfolded, sparing neither the darkness of the crime nor the quiet dignity of its innocent victim. The case of the innkeeper's daughter was not, in the strictest sense, among the most celebrated of Holmes's investigations. It never carried the public sensation of some of our other adventures, involving as it did no titled aristocracy of any genuine standing, no international intrigue beyond the modest scope of a Kentish village and a Lisbon notary's forged papers, no crime committed against the great and famous whose names alone might command a nation's fascinated attention. And yet I have always numbered it, in my own private reckoning, among the cases that revealed most clearly the particular genius that set Sherlock Holmes apart from every other investigator, official or private, that I encountered across the whole span of our long friendship. Not merely his extraordinary powers of observation and deduction, remarkable as those unquestionably were, but the patient, almost reverent care with which he pursued a truth that promised him no fame, no reward beyond the modest fee Josiah Thorne had insisted upon pressing into his hands, and no satisfaction save the private knowledge that a wrong, once done, had been answered as fully as human justice could contrive to answer it. "Come, Watson," Holmes said at last, setting aside his violin as the final notes faded into the quiet of our sitting room. "You look as though you could do with something stronger than tea this evening, and I confess I find myself in agreement. We have earned, I think, one evening's rest before the next problem finds its way to our door. And find its way it inevitably shall, for London's capacity to generate fresh mysteries appears, in my considerable experience, to be entirely inexhaustible." He was, as ever, quite correct in this prediction, though the particulars of what followed belong properly to another account, set down upon another occasion. For that night, at least, we asked nothing more of the world than the warmth of our own fire, the comfortable silence of long friendship, and the quiet, private satisfaction of a difficult truth honestly pursued and, at considerable cost, finally and fully brought to light. The end.